Okay, so this is the Bible study for Exodus chapter 6, verses 1 through 12. And our text for today says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But my name, the Lord, but by my name, the Lord, I do not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. Then the Lord said to Moses, Go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his country. But Moses said to the Lord, If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips? So we're going to stop there for today. And remember that you can download a PDF copy of the Bible study so that you can follow along with us as we ask the questions about this text at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And number one says, what happened in last week's Bible study? A, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. That's true. B, Pharaoh made things harder on the Egyptians than it was before. That's true. C, Pharaoh blamed everything on Moses and Aaron so that the people were upset for the trouble they had brought on. That's true. And then D, Moses went to God asking him why. And that's how we ended the text last week. Is Pharaoh wasn't going to do it. He made the labor harsher. No straw. They had to still make the same number of bricks. They weren't meeting their quotas, so they were getting whipped, and they were getting the slave masters were being very hard on them. The overseers, who were Israelites who had been put over their own people under the supervision of the slave drivers, were at a loss trying to understand what was happening. They went to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, this is why you're being told to do this. So they met Moses and Aaron right afterwards and said, why are you doing this to us? You've made everything worse. And what does Moses do? He goes to God. Why did you do this? Why did you make things worse? And so we talked a little bit about that at the end of the Bible study last week. Number two, what did God say to Moses in 6:1, seemingly in response to Moses's question? So Moses ended the text from last week asking why, and God, this continues on. So we drew a line and we stopped for the week and moved on, waited a week to study this, but it's really written all together. So the verse 1 of chapter 6, really the Lord answers Moses when Moses says, why have you done this? Why did you do this to me? And make me the bad guy here? And God answers in 6:1, seemingly in response to Moses's question. God says, now you will see. So that's how God begins what he says to Moses, his answer to Moses's question, why? The answer is, now you will see. I'm about to do something that will seem impossible to you, and it will seem even more impossible and outlandish because of what how Pharaoh responded at the beginning, because things got worse for the moment, you know that it wasn't what you did or any sort of human interaction that caused this, but rather you'll know that it's me. Now you will see what I can do. B, I've got Pharaoh right where I want him. That's a paraphrase, right? But basically he's saying, now it's time. Now that things have gotten worse, now that Pharaoh has said no, I have a chance to shine. And he's basically saying, I've got Pharaoh right where I want him. Before, you know, we could have done this and Pharaoh could have responded, but now Pharaoh has said no. And now it's the time when I, God, am going to show you what I can do. And it won't be because Pharaoh was gracious, and it won't be because you're persuasive. It's going to be because of my mighty hand. See, it's almost as if you needed this to be worse than it was, so that I could show you that I still have this under control. And then D, because of my mighty hand. Now, is this true? That the worse the situation is, the more likely we are to realize that it was actually God that did it and not us. As long as the situation seems mild, we have a tendency to take credit for what we do when we go, negotiate with Pharaoh, for instance, or whatever. And so sometimes the situation has to get worse to the place where we see it as completely hopeless, where we're at the place where we're ready to cry out to God because there's no other answer. And sometimes we're mad at God because he let it get like this to begin with. And it's at that point when God can do his work and we will acknowledge it as God, because it couldn't have been us. And I would say this is true of many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, that unfortunately, when God answers small prayers, we don't recognize it as God. But when he answers big prayers that are impossible, we can see it. And so what does that mean? It means sometimes God has to let things get so bad so that he can show us that it's not us that did this, it's him. Number 3, what does God tell Moses in 6:2-5? He says, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but my name, the Lord, I did not make fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. I am the Lord. A. B, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I did not make myself fully known. So they didn't know the fullness of who I am. They knew that I was God, and they met with me, they heard from me, but they didn't know my fullness. C, I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. And then D, I've heard the groaning of the Israelites. And by the way, at the end of that part, he says, and I remembered my covenant. I heard the groaning of the Israelites, and I haven't forgotten the agreement that I made with them from the beginning, from back in the times of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so I'm hearing and I'm responding. Number 4, what does God tell Moses to say to the Israelites according to 6:6-8? A, I am the Lord. So in 6, he says, therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. That's a theme. God says it to Moses, but then he tells Moses, you got to say this to them. B, I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And notice there's quotes because this is coming right out of these verses. C, I will free you and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty acts of judgment. So what's the judgment's going to come on the Egyptians. The judgment is going to come on those who have oppressed Israel. And so by judging those who have oppressed, he redeems those that are his children. D, I will take you as my own people and I will be your God. That becomes an important theme. I will be your God and you will be my people. You will be for me a peculiar people. We hear that repeated in the New Testament and applied to the church. And we know that God is trying to preserve for himself a people. E, then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And that's true. And by the way, he uses that in the rest of the Old Testament and even some in the New Testament. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And so he defines who he is by what he did here for most of the rest of Israel's history. F, I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. So he's making promises, which ultimately are just promises to fulfill the promises that he's already made. Number 5, what happened in 6:9? A, Moses told the Israelites. B, the Israelites rallied around Moses and recognized him as God's messenger and followed him happily ever after. Nope. That's not what happened. That would have been nice. God came and spoke. God came and answered these questions that Moses had, the why, and God said, "Don't worry, I got this." And so you need to go talk to the Israelites, and Moses did, and it wasn't happily ever after, and it didn't all of a sudden get easy. But see, the Israelites did not listen to him because of their discouragement. So they were so discouraged, and they were under this harsh labor, just like Pharaoh was intending, that they were just not interested in hearing it. Number 6, where did God send Moses next, according to 6:10 through 11? It says, then Lord said to Moses, go tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his country. So Israelites still going to talk to Pharaoh. And number 7, how did Moses respond according to 6:12? But Moses said to the Lord, if the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips? So one, Pharaoh wasn't listening to him before because God said wasn't good enough for him. But Moses is saying it's because I speak with faltering lips. It's because I'm a poor speaker. That's the reason he won't listen to me. He has no reason to listen to me. Number 8 says, I know that about now you're tired of Moses's arguing with God. I am, but really, what would you have done? And the point of this is to remember, one, that Moses is human, but Moses ultimately obeyed. 2, to realize that we can criticize and be frustrated, but ultimately, for a lot of us, if we compared what Moses is saying with the way that we talk to God, we would find it very similar. And 3, if we don't like the way Moses responded, God works with them. God brings them along. But if we don't think that it's appropriate the way Moses responded, then why do we keep doing it? Why don't we recognize our own arguments against God, our own distrust of God, and say, no, I'm not going to think like that. I'm not going to live like that. I am going to trust God. Why don't we, if we read this and we say, man, Moses is so thick-headed, Moses is so stubborn, Moses won't do what God says. By the way, in the end, Moses does not enter the promised land because of his own lack of faith and unwillingness to do what God calls him to do in its entirety and in its immediacy. And so there comes a time when the consequences of that frustrating slowness to trust in God are going to be visited upon Moses. And so we can talk about what great things God did through him, but ultimately he doesn't enter the promised land on this earth because of his lack of faith. And so when we look at this, Moses is not the hero that we sometimes think he's should be. He's not the person that we want to become fully. So we can look at his life and say, yeah, I want to be used of God. I want to be a person of faith. I want to be an instrument of God the way Moses was in so many instances. Absolutely. But when we read things like this and we read his arguments with God and his lack of faith in these moments, we realize that that ultimately cost him his chance to enter the promised land. And we got to ask, what does that do to us if we model ourselves after him? And if we read it and say, man, why does he act like this? And we see some of ourselves in it, then we got to ask ourselves, is this how I ought to be interacting with God? Or is it possible that I need to find a way to trust him and stop arguing and stop blaming and choose to do his will faster, earlier, sooner, instead of after all this argument, the way Moses so often did?